As far as I can tell, GM is not talking about specific tariffs, right? Is it talking about the EU? Is it talking about Canada? Is it talking about all of it?
Well, what they're talking about is this 232 investigation that would slap potentially big tariffs on imported vehicles. And GM just directionally doesn't like where this is going. They import a few cars from Europe, a little bit from China, quite a bit from Mexico. And what they're saying is if you start taxing vehicles, theirs or anybody else's, you're basically going to reduce auto sales, you're going to reduce jobs. If it does impact GM's ability to make cars, and I would think they're specifically referring to Mexico, then it undercuts their profits, which in the statement they say even if they're made in Mexico, they do come back here and help in investment in jobs and R&D in the U.S. And it could just basically make the company less competitive overall. This is an unusually direct statement from GM. They've always handled the Trump administration with kid gloves. The language may not be really inflammatory, but they are absolutely opposed to the policy and the tariffs, and they don't think the investigation should result in bigger tariffs, and they're pretty direct about it.
So just to make clear then, David, we're not talking about external tariffs on U.S. cars. We're talking about GM making cars elsewhere and then them being taxed as they're brought into the United States to sell in the United States.
That's right, and they do quite a bit of it, especially from Mexico. It's Chevrolet alone is supposed to import more than 800,000 vehicles this year, and they make some pretty important vehicles down there. Full-size pickup trucks, the small Chevy Equinox sport utility vehicle, another big one that's high volume and makes good money for them. These aren't a bunch of small cars, so GM wants to make sure that they've got the ability to bring in vehicles and, for that matter, parts from other countries, so that it doesn't raise the cost of their vehicles, lower sales, lower their profits, and they can continue business as usual.
David, I'm asking you to speculate, but why now? Why do you think GM's coming out at this moment, particularly in a week where we've had Harley-Davidson protesting and disagreement over ultimately what that means for US jobs and US production in particular? Why now for GM?
Well, today's the deadline for testimony or opinions on this 232 investigation. Remember, the 232 investigation tries to find out if imported goods are creating some kind of national security risk. They did it with aluminum and steel, and the excuse was that aluminum is used in military production, therefore we need healthy aluminum smelters and healthy steel makers around the country. And that was an acceptable reason, the Commerce Department decided, and so those tariffs are in place. With cars, they're still sort of in the investigating or they're giving this a good look, and they did want input from the car makers and anybody else who had an interest. Some of the automakers just decided to let their trade groups handle it. GM decided to come out with a two-page, fairly direct statement on this to say that they don't like it, and it could result in a smaller GM, fewer profits, fewer jobs.
And David, as you say, this is unusual for General Motors amongst its peers, but also for the company itself to be taking this sort of adversarial attack with the administration. What is that telling us? And does it signal a bigger shift, or is it just on this particular issue?
It probably is on this particular issue, but remember, early in Trump's administration, a number of CEOs were quitting his committees for different social issues, whether it was immigration, the Muslim ban, you name it. And Mary Barra, the CEO of GM, was on one of those committees, and she was one of the last to leave. Many other CEOs took a leadership role, and she kind of hung out to see what would happen and eventually did leave. But she certainly wasn't a leader in that regard. In this situation, she's making a very direct statement. Whether or not, I don't think it's a shift. I think GM will handle Trump's policies policy by policy. This is a case, though, where GM really does want and need free trade because they do a lot of business in Mexico, a lot of production there, and they've got a massive presence in China.
David, it's tough to unpack all this because we've got the EU's response to the United States and the autos. We've obviously got Canada responding in their own way today to the steel and aluminium, and the talk there that if it came down to it, tariffs on autos could ultimately be really painful. We've had at the G7 as well mooted the prospect of zero tariffs. What would zero tariffs mean for US automakers?
In that case, you might have, zero tariffs. But let's take NAFTA, for example. Probably not much impact there because right now it is a free trade agreement. With Europe, conceivably the U.S. automakers could sell more vehicles into Europe because you have on cars you have a 10% tariff going into Europe. Conceivably they could, but General Motors pulled out of the market. They don't even really have brands selling there in a meaningful way. Some Corvettes, some Cadillacs, that's about it. Maybe Ford could send more cars over there. They still have a big business. But it's a pretty saturated market already. It could help with Europe. And maybe it could help with China, but we don't really, Trump got us down to 15% for vehicles going into China, and that seems to be where that's going to stay. No one's going to build a new plant or start exporting from the U.S. to China with a 15% tariff. Going from 25 to 15 is going to do nothing. So, zero tariffs, I think would kind of be steady as she goes, business as usual. I don't see it having a big impact unless, maybe GM wanted to try to build one of its brands, say Cadillac, in Europe. It could help there, but that's about it.